Gaming as entertainment has been around in some form for centuries. And obviously, so is people standing in line saying, "I'm the one got cheated." But board and card games aren't the gaming we're exploring. The gaming we're talking about has been spread across numerous media forms, from international blockbuster films, their sequels, and prequels. From the horrifying to the fantasy-driven, the action-packed, even when the action's a little horrible, to the heroic, and some things we should forget ever happened. Yeah, that did just happen. The show wasn't that bad, but the opening, gaming is probably one of the best known forms of entertainment the world over. In 2020, the estimated value of the gaming industry was $173.7 billion. And now it's estimated by 2026 to reach $314.4 billion. Now, if that isn't printing your own money, I don't know what is. But how did we get here? How did this form of entertainment become large enough to cross all platforms, media forms, cultures, and beyond? That's what we're going to explore today in the history of gaming. Before we fully start the video up, please remember to go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe. And I want to hear from you all. Let us know in the comments whether you remember any of these games, think they're strange, which I'm sure some of you have to, or any of this old media that you're going to see throughout. All right, let's jump into it. The year's 1962. We got the first Walmart. A guy you might have heard of, Andy Warhol, decided to come out with one of probably the most famous paintings in the world. And of course, the Jetsons. Oh yeah, it's that old. But that's also where we start our story. A couple of grads from MIT decided to create something called Space War. Not the most impressive game in the world, this would be considered the first video game. In 1966 came the first experimental TV computer interface, which led us into '67, where the original adventure mainframe maze game came out. Pretty much, just think of it as the original text-based adventure game. You know, where in the world's Carmen Sandiego, the Oregon Trail. In 1971, Computer Space becomes the first coin-operated arcade game. I mean, look at those graphics. How could you turn this thing down? And yes, that marketing is real. Marketing was a little bit different back then. How she's standing there and she's holding the very tip of the... This guy would actually be the founder of Atari. We all know him as Nolan Bushnell. At this point, Pong becomes the first arcade hit. And of course, that's where we get the name, the Pong era. In the Pong era comes the Magnavox Odyssey, the world's first commercial home video game console. Comes with paddle hockey. Then, Atari's home Pong system would be released. While not very visually appealing, very graphically advanced, this thing kept your attention for hours. It kept the attention of nations for hours. Obviously, you really had nothing better to do in the 70s. Then a year later, Magnavox would release the Odyssey 200, which added sound and scoring to Video Badminton. Video Badminton, which let's just say was Pong all over again. That's not a problem, right? Then in 1976, the Fairchild's Channel F console would be released. This was the first cartridge-based home video game system. It was advertised as the home video console that never gets old. By simply replacing one cartridge, you can switch up the fun from game to game.
Shooting gallery, or just doodle. Switch video carts and play Desert Fox. Switch again, it's Blackjack. Or play the 2 built-in games, Pro Hockey or Tennis Champ. Channel F for fun, the Fairchild Video Entertainment System, just $169.95.
Wait a minute, $170? That's worth like $1,200 today. Now you can tell your parents that your grandparents spent $1,200 on them for a console back when they were younger, so why not go ahead and get you that PS5 or Xbox Series X?
Knowledge.
And in that same year, big money would exchange hands as Atari sold to Warner for $28 million. Now, is this going to make any difference in the future? I wonder. Then in 1977, the first video game crash happened. This one would be known as the hardware plague. With the overabundance of home Pong clones, all the clone manufacturers die off, but Atari survives. I guess that deal did make a lot of sense then. The very next year, in 1978, Atari would release the VCS 2600, which comes with a paddle and joystick and a combat cartridge. Magnavox releases the Odyssey 2 to compete with the 2600. Now wait a minute. This is all starting to sound really familiar.
What do you mean by that?
That same year, Space Invaders was released. This was the first US video game to hit mega status. Also, it was the first game to provide a continuous high score display. In Japan, it converted the entire nation into arcade fans. And in the US, it launched sales of the 2600 substantially. I mean, look at that game. It's a far cry from Pong. Then in 1979 came four nerds to rule them all. These four ex-Atari programmers would found Activision. It's the first video game software house. During this time, the annual rate of new cartridge releases begins to double from a few dozen this year to over 500 in 1983. I don't think that's going to be a problem. Do you? At the same time, Asteroids, the first arcade game with an electronic scoreboard, which allowed high-scoring players to tap their initials onto the trophy screen at the end of a record-beating game, was released. This was the original space shooter. Then in 1980, wait a minute, that's not the original marketing photos, but at this point, Mattel's Intellivision would be released, alongside some of the hottest games of the year, including Missile Command. Missile Command had 3 left-hand fire buttons and a trackball for guiding the missiles, and was the first game to use a separate sighting device for aiming. What would gaming be without the glutton himself? Pac-Man. This was the ultimate arcade game. It was everything the 80s was, with the kiddie arcade aesthetic, simple action control stick, bright colors, animation breaks between levels, and characters with cute nicknames. Then in 1981, Nintendo and Sega began exporting arcade games to the US. And then came Frogger. This was the original 100 Ways to Die, and would go on to become one of the top games of the era. At the time, Frogger had more ways to die than any game before it, and would hold that title for years to come. Not to be outdone, Centipede, another slide and shoot game the likes of Space Invaders, though Centipede was leaps beyond Space Invaders, as its trackball allowed you the ability to float up and down versus just left to right, as well as giving unlimited firepower. Then in 1982, ColecoVision debuts with superior graphics, Zaxxon, an Atari adapter.
Hold up, wait a minute, something ain't right.
Yep, an Atari adapter. You hearing this, Microsoft and Sony? And our favorite ape. No, not that one. Yeah, that one. The original Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong would be Nintendo's first American hit. This climbing platformer style game's joystick and jump controls would be the precursor to martial arts games' leaps and strike formats. Donkey Kong would also be the world's introduction to an overweight, mustached plumber named
It's me, Mario!
The Atari 5200, a clone of the Atari 400 just without the keyboard, finally ships. But it has no backward compatibility with its predecessor, the Atari 2600. To bring more cutesy, colorful animation to the world of video games, Q*bert was then released. And Dig Dug, one of the most misunderstood games of its time. Around this time, the Bally Astrocade would be released, and it would bring one of its era's greatest games to the forefront. Tron, a video game based on a movie, based on a computer game, based on a video game. Tron was several games all in one. It used scenes from the movies to actually springboard the gameplay. Light cycles, tank battle, and final showdown with the complex. It was one of the first arcade games without printed instructions on the cabinet, and you simply had to fire the trigger on Tron's plastic joystick to see them on screen. And just as everyone's ready for the peak of the video game industry to come, 1983 brings the second video game crash, this time known as the software plague. With the constantly growing number of third-party cartridges, consumers just can't figure out what's good, what's bad, and what's ugly. This causes a lot of those cartridges to go into a constant cycle of discount and loss, therefore hurting the companies that created them. And at this point, with the second video game crash, the entire gaming industry had to ask itself,
Do you want to continue or not?
And even during the midst of the software plague, Pole Position, which would go on to be the first hit driving game, and Punch-Out, which would spawn one of the best known boxing games of the era and probably of gaming, would both be released. At the same time, however, Nintendo had just introduced something new in Japan. But as for the US, the home video game industry is virtually non-existent. What can help it? I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I want to hear from you what you thought of the video. Are you excited for part 2 and 3? And also, have you played any of these games, or which ones do you remember or have you never heard of? Go ahead and smash that like button. Make sure to subscribe most definitely and help me keep this channel growing. Thanks a lot. I'm the Shell Bullet 8, but for now, I'm out.